Hello and welcome to the next episode of the channel. Today we will talk a little bit about coppering and protection of ships. This was an interesting topic that took quite a long time to solve. The protection of the hose fell under two categories. The one was protecting it from Teredo navalis, the ever-present wood-eating critter which could theoretically convert a vessel into a pile of waste in no time at all. These little blighters are the bane of the archaeologist's life too, because it is because of them that we have so little timber surviving. They tend to like warm and pleasant waters. Wherever it is pleasant to dive, they absolutely love it. They hate bad conditions, for example, very cold water like the Baltic, or water with very low salinity and very low levels of oxygen like the Black Sea, or at least the deeper part of the Black Sea. So, on the one hand side, the challenge for shipwrights and especially for naval administrators was how to protect the hose from the Teredo navalis, especially as European ships began to undertake longer and longer voyages into tropical waters. The second part of it was that as the ship remained afloat, all sorts of things decided that it is a perfectly good place to create a garden and a pleasant home for themselves. Starting with seagrass and seaweed that began growing on the hose, moving to barnacles. We all remember Captain Haddock from Tintin shouting blue blistering barnacles. Most of them are not blue, but they certainly are blistering. All of this growth could slow ship dramatically. In fact, it was believed that to maintain normal operational abilities for a ship, you had to clean them anywhere within every 6 weeks to maybe at the most 3 months. It is very notable that in the 1639 campaign, the greatest of all Dutch admirals, Marten Tromp, maintained his fleet in good operation while he was waiting to intercept the Spanish fleet, which was supposed to reinforce the Spanish Netherlands. Marten Tromp tended to pull ships out of his line, out of his operation every 3 to 4 weeks, maximum 4 weeks, to have them cleaned. He found it to be that important to maintain speed, to maintain maneuverability of his vessels. And in a way, the cleaner the ship, the more operationally effective the vessel was, and also the more protected the hull. So of course the question was how to improve the length between the different cleanings. That was a challenge that was not resolved until the middle, really the second half of the 18th century. It's not that the ideas did not abound before that. Of course they did. The simplest and the most strongly considered in the 17th century and in the 16th to some extent was covering the vessel with lead sheet. Experiments were carried out with this. Iberian vessels attempted it. The English Royal Navy under the Charles II's very intelligent leadership attempted and experimented with lead sheathing. And they discovered very quickly that this is a no-go proposition, mostly because lead, water, and the irons of the rudders reacted together, ate up the iron, and ships lost their rudders. For example, Henrietta, Sir John Norborough's flagship during his war against the Barbary pirates, lost her rudder exactly this way. The iron became too eaten up. There was a problem also with the Charles galley. For a while, administrators were wondering exactly what is happening, and amazingly enough, it was the king himself who first figured out that the problem is exactly the interaction between the lead and the iron. in salt water. No, they were unable to explain how and why this is happening, but they were perfectly, or at least the king was aware, that this was due to interaction between different metals in the saltwater situation. So they reverted to the more traditional, older system of sheathing ships going to tropical waters with thin planks. They were known as deal. Usually it is some kind of a pine. It was a cheaper wood in fairly thin, up to 1.5 inches, 2 inches thickness, that was nailed on top of the normal hull planking. First, the hull was covered with pitch and hair, animal hair, and we believe that mostly horse hair was used, but archaeology has demonstrated that all sorts of hair was used. For example, the English ship Warwick, which was wrecked in Bermuda in 1619, on which I had the privilege of participating in the excavation of this vessel. Analysis suggested that at least some of the hair used between the two layers of the planking, the protective sheathing and the hull planking, was from deer, believe it or not. On top of this mixture, the hair, it was believed that the hair glued in place with the pitch is going to choke the Teredo navalis and will prevent them from eating it up. I'm unprepared to state how effective that idea was and whether they were right or wrong, but they believed it and they carried on experimenting with this. On top of this mixture was nailed the actual wooden planks. They were covered with what was known as tacks, small short iron nails with wide heads. The idea was that as they start corroding, the corrosion will enter and impregnate the plank around, and this will prevent the Teredo navalis from entering it and hopefully inhibit growth on the bottom of the hull. The problem, of course, is that this is a system that does damage the main planking of the vessel. Sheathing usually had to be replaced every couple of years, if not more often. This did not prevent ships from having to be regularly cleaned if they were to retain operational speed and ability to get out of its own way. So it was sort of a solution, but not really the ultimate solution to the problem. By the middle of the 18th century, the Admiralty, especially in England, was beginning to very seriously consider the issue. The advantage that Great Britain had over its rivals was its industrial base. Great Britain was far ahead in this than most of its rivals and would remain at the forehead until really the beginning of the 20th century, when Germany started catching up with Great Britain. Early attempts to experiment with coppering was done as early as the 1750s, late 50s, when sheeting were sent to the dockyards to be applied to some of the smaller vessels experimentally. The idea seemed to be workable, but of course they encountered the old enemy, the interaction between the more noble metal and the iron of the boats of the hull and the rather pintos and gudgeons. By then they were aware that where the basis of the problem lay. The question was how to solve it. The real impetus, however, came after the return of the Navy in 1762, after the campaigns in the Caribbean, because the Admiralty and the dockyards, really the Navy board, were shocked by the state of the ship's bottoms. So that was what gave impetus to really start working on the problem. Copper seemed to be the most workable of the solutions, and that is why they concentrated on this. Gradually, from the 60s through the 70s, more experiments were carried out. The gudgeons and pintos were changed from iron, started being made out of copper alloys that were more resistant to this. Early on, they recognized that, of course, there still leaves the problem of the iron boats. What we're hoping that isolating as much as possible the boats from the copper sheathing will solve the problem. So copper was applied in the following way. On the bottom was covered, the bottoms of the ships were covered with paper, which was tarred. On top of the tarred paper, a fairly thick layer of it, the copper plates were attached. Gradually, standard sizes of copper plates were introduced. They were usually 4 feet long by about 14 inches wide. Subsequently, 3 weights of copper were used, 32, 28, and 22 ounce per foot. The heaviest plates were distributed in the bow area. The stem, were covering the stem, and the gripe, this area of the vessel. Immediately after it were the middle range of copper plates, and the rest of the hull, which was believed to encounter less resistance, was covered with the lightest of the copper plates. Copper, the initial attempts with copper were with much lighter than this plates, but they were wearing out way too quickly. In the early versions, in the early 70s of the 18th century, at the beginning of the American Revolutionary War, the plans were to copper the vessel to up to 16 inches below the waterline. And the last few inches were covered with elm planks. The idea was that this will protect the coppering from boats, dockings, and other such damage. That changed as time. By the 1780s, however, the idea was that the coppering should actually be carried to above the waterline rather than below the waterline. To this period dates also the introduction of the 3-inch elm batten, which was supposed to protect the upper edge of the coppering. How was the copper applied? It was built up from the bottom upwards. The copper plates were overlapping, and the instructions from the Navy Board were asking for somewhere between 3/4 and 7/8 of an inch overlap. In the very first vessels, in the early 70s, the copper plates were in columns rather than the checkerboard or scattered formation that eventually by 1779, by 1780, certainly the practice was to scatter and to spread the coppering in the overlaps between the copper plates. They said you copper from the bottom upwards. The keel was separately coppered, of course, and the false keel was not coppered. The keel was coppered completely, and the false keel was attached on the outside. The false keel was attached through the copper sheets to the main keel with a mixture of copper nails and iron nails, with the corrosion of the iron nails supposedly protecting the false keel. The question that I have, and I have not seen any references to this and how this, what about the interaction between copper and iron? Weren't they considered? For the boats, it was a major issue. For the rudder, pintos and gudgeons, it was an issue. So how come it was not an issue for the false keel? That probably was something that was considered expendable, replaceable material. That probably is why they cared less. And gradually, of course, this was abandoned too. So that is how coppering came about. Why did it become so dominant? It was very, very expensive. Coppering a ship of the line, a 74-gun ship of the line, ran in the vicinity of 1,500 pounds, which was a substantial amount of money indeed. However, England was in a strategically unenviable position, and coppering the vessels was a force multiplier. In order to keep a fleet in being, you had to have something in the vicinity of 1/3 of the ships constantly being refitted, being cleaned, and in other words, not being available for service. With the coppering, you no longer had to clean the ships so often. And the refits were essentially re-rigging, cleaning up, so repairing the rig, but it did not involve any more unloading the vessel, hauling it down, and cleaning the bottoms, which speeded the process dramatically. The coppering increased noticeably the speed of exactly the same vessel prior to coppering and subsequently to coppering. Captains commented in their letters to the Navy Board and to the Admiralty how astonished they were by the increase in speed. So by the very fact that they had to go into port to be repaired much more rarely than non-coppered vessels, by the fact that the ships were so much faster, all of this acted as force multiplier. Of course, it was obvious to anyone that you cannot keep together and you cannot maneuver a fleet if the vessels have such dramatic difference in speed as coppered and non-coppered ships had between them. So that was how the Admiralty was, and Parliament more importantly, was persuaded to shake out the money and copper the fleet. This ultimately is what saved England in truly dire strategic situation, when for the first time since the 17th century the Royal Navy had found itself heavily outnumbered by the coalition against them. The Spanish, the French, and the Dutch fleets, after all, were all enemy. Not one of them had been defeated prior to this situation, and it threatened major military catastrophe. Of course, thanks at least partially to coppering, as to operational logistics, as to the ability of the British officer corps and the training of their crews. By 1782, as we know, the tide had shifted in favor of Great Britain, especially with the great victory of Admiral Rodney at the Battle of the Saints. So, briefly, this is the history of coppering in the fleets. Now, as far as ship modeling is concerned, there are different ways that coppering can be represented. And in the workshop of the SYSTER channel, where I am currently sitting, there were times when this was the storage area for my sailing equipment. There are different approaches that you can undertake. In the background over here is the model of Speedy, still under construction, as you can see. In this case, the coppering, though it is done quite nicely, the design of the plates is well executed by the kit manufacturer. The spacing of the boats is close enough to the reality, and at the same time it is not too sharp to the point where it is going to start poking at your eyes and telling you that this ship is suffering from the smallpox. So it is delicate enough. In this case, the plates, however, are not overlapping. They are aligned next to each other like a brick wall, but they do not overlap. Still, visually, it does not make a huge difference in comparison with how a real ship would have looked like. So, viable option. The other version is this little sloop of war, also in different stages of unfinish, as you can see. In the case of this vessel, the copper plates are overlapping. I have not actually said that. Maybe I should do it. I haven't sat down to measure whether it really is scale 3/4 to 7/8 of an inch overlap, as the instructions to the dockyards requested and required them to be. Maybe I should do it in a moment when I decide to be truly nasty and a major pain in the neck. This coppering is beautiful, the system is beautiful, but the thickness in the overlap might be a little too overstated in comparison with other systems. It can't be helped. There, after all, are manufacturing practicalities of how thin you can make the copper foil and still be operational. And finally, this is the third option that we have, how to present copper. In the case of this is the Boreas model that you have seen already at least a couple of times on this channel, and heaven knows how many times on the other, on the sister channel up there. So, on the Boreas, whoever built the hull did it in a completely different way. There, they just took long strips of copper, applied them to the hull, and after that, probably with a chisel or something along these lines, marked the separate copper plates on it. It's a legitimate way to do it, by all means. I should point out also, and to some extent this is visible here on the Boreas better. See, they are next to each other, they're aligned, but they are not overlapping. Only the simulation. I think that this actually is a fairly effective way of doing it, because with the overlap, if you really do it with properly overlapping, it protrudes, the copper protrudes way too much in scale. If you start measuring it, it will mean that you have something in the vicinity of thickness of a few inches. And that, I think, is exaggerated. I do prefer the understated rather than the overstated details on a model. And in this case, the final thing that I should say is that the strakes, the belts of the coppering, aimed to parallel the strakes of the planking under. That is why you're going to see on real ships, on the few contemporary models that do have coppering, they everywhere have the lowest part here amidships. You can essentially see the same shear as the planking. And with this, I wish you a most wonderful rest of the day. Thank you very, very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Looking forward to your comments, likes, and questions.